Hi, everybody. We're just still a couple minutes before starting, so welcome. I'm Jan Masoka, one of the co-chairs of the Philanthropy Project, and welcome. And so please, if you feel like making a comment or asking a question in advance, put it in the chat, or just tell us who you are and what your interest is in attending this leadership briefing today. We're expecting, well, we have what, 760 people signed up. So it shows, I think, that there's really a lot of interest in this topic. Reforming philanthropy is something that gets talked a lot by nonprofits, but not always in mixed company, in company with foundations and funders as well. So this is a good chance to hear some insightful critique. So again, if you're just joining us, please introduce yourself or ask a question or make a comment in the chat box if you'd like to. And we'll be starting at 1 minute after the hour, which is in 2 exact minutes. So make yourself at home for the next 2 minutes while we get everything organized. I see we have one person saying hi from northern New Hampshire. Okay, it must be pretty cold there. And also someone from Kauai. So actually, one person who's freezing and one person who's like probably in a swimsuit under swaying palm trees. And some other friends I see coming on. I think everybody can see them. That's great. Honolulu, Moreno Valley, Philadelphia, Minnesota. Chris says, a current hot topic, there's something about a section deeply focused on funding social change with 5% of assets. So are you thinking there's some kind of contradiction there between high priority and 5%? Is that kind of the implication that you're making? Well, welcome everybody. We're going to start in 1 minute. I see people now coming from Indianapolis and Connecticut, Ohio, St. Louis, Portland, Oregon. So that's great to see everybody. I'm Jan from the Philanthropy Project, and you can see not only the pictures, but also the actual people that are going to be on our panel today. Here's somebody from Edmonds, from Oakland, from Washington, D.C. So a nice geographic sprinkling from all over. Another person from Portland, a couple more people from Portland. So it's nice to see. It's very here. I'm in San Francisco, and it's still very gloomy here. I have to say, it actually rained last night, and we're all cold for what we think of as cold here in California. Okay, it's 1 minute after. John Pratt, who's the other co-chair of the Philanthropy Project, is going to be welcoming you, telling you a little bit about the project, and then introducing the panelists and turning it over to our moderator, Al Cantor. Okay, John, your hands.
Right. Thanks, Jan. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Philanthropy Project's first leadership briefing on reforming philanthropy. Today's focus is going to be on U.S. private foundations. I'm John Pratt, and I serve as co-chair of the Philanthropy Project, along with Jan Masaoka, and I'm here from Minneapolis, Minnesota. The Philanthropy Project is a national campaign formed in 2024 to maximize the impact of charitable giving. Our primary goal is to increase the amount of philanthropy actually put to active use for the public good. To accomplish this goal, we are counseled by a thoughtful and connected working group you can see listed here, 3 of whom will be speaking as part of today's program. Key to the success of this series is getting the word out, and for that, we want to thank 6 great organizations that stepped up to be co-sponsors: Cal Nonprofits, Center for Nonprofit Advancement in Washington, D.C., Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, the Nonprofit Quarterly, based in Boston, and Nonprofit AF, founded in Seattle, but now everywhere. To dig into the challenges and better futures of private foundations, we're proud to have assembled a hardworking team to dig into these issues. Al Cantor will serve as program moderator. Al is a writer and consultant on issues facing the nonprofit sector, based in Concord, New Hampshire, with a very long career managing nonprofits and advocating for good philanthropy. Joining Al Cantor will be three panelists. First, Vu Lei, the founder and former executive director of RVC in Seattle, and now a national voice with a new book, and who's made the point better than perhaps anyone else that there's tons of humor in the nonprofit world. And I'm sure we're going to hear some of that. Next, Bella Devan, director of the Charity Reform Initiative with the Institute for Policy Studies in DC, which just published a new list of the top 20 nonprofit recipients of charitable contributions, and wrote her undergrad thesis on the 1969 Tax Reform Act. Finally, Craig Kennedy, our experienced private foundation leader, former program officer and then president of the Joyce Foundation in Chicago, and then president of the German Marshall Fund, and now the most cogent guest writer for the Chronicle of Philanthropy. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Al Cantor.
Thank you very much, John and Jan, and welcome to all of you from around the country. It's great to be here. Now, I'm going to avoid saying what I've heard dozens of times at conferences and on webinars where people say, we have such an exciting panel in front of you. And that never is true. Panels typically are the first person talks for 25 minutes, the second person talks for 20 minutes, the third person repeats everything the first two people said, and then you break for lunch, and it's not very exciting. This is, by contrast, going to be a conversation with Vu, Craig, and Bella, and I will try to keep the conversation moving along, but it should not be a problem. These are people who know what they're talking about. And I think what we're all talking about is the central power imbalance, whereby private foundations have a lot of money and nonprofits want to get some of that money as much as possible. It struck me when I saw how much money there is in the private foundations, $1.6 trillion. That is 1.6, a trillion is 1,000 billion, if you can imagine that. So that's 1.6 thousand billion dollars. And of course, a billion is 1,000 million, and a million might be something we can get our arms around. So there's just a pile of money there, huge amount of money, all of which would be great if it were flowing out to good causes in a free-flowing basis. It's not. Many foundations are reluctant to distribute their assets. The requirements are minimal, and a lot of them use end-arounds schemes to avoid paying even the 5% that is required. Many foundations are overly focused on their own perpetuity and way unfocused on helping communities, helping the kinds of causes that need to be supported. And a lot of foundations, the staff and the boards are removed from the issues that are driving the sector. Today won't be just a complaint session. We're going to be talking about these issues. We're going to be talking about it directly. And we're going to be talking about possible solutions and ways that people around the country in the nonprofit sector can and should get involved. So that's my introduction. And I'm gonna start things going by asking Bella. Bella was one of the authors of a report that was subtitled "Saving Philanthropy from Wall Street." Why does philanthropy need to be changed? Need to be saved, Bella? Could you tell us a little bit about that and what's going on? What's the problem with foundations?
Thanks, Al. Well, I'll do my best. I think everything you just said really illustrates the problem. And thanks so much to everybody for being here and including me on this all-star panel. I think I don't have to explain to everybody here how unbelievable inequality is in America in terms of wealth distribution. And the country's biggest philanthropists become wealthier every single day from the appreciating value of their stock holdings, from their unrealized assets. a lot of super rich Americans live off of the buy, borrow, die philosophy, which is skimming cash off of their pools of wealth, using lines of credit to avoid incurring taxable income. And our team really has studied and believes that their philanthropic practices are mirroring their tactics to accrue, preserve, and defend their wealth. There's a way to, use philanthropy and donations to charitable intermediaries, which the wealthy overwhelmingly prefer when they make charitable gifts, unlike regular people who give directly to the organizations they support. There's a really troubling trend that the largest and wealthiest foundations treat their 5% annual payout requirement as a ceiling instead of a floor. I have a new statistic hot off the presses from our amazing research director, Helen Flannery, which is that in 2024, the latest year we have tax information available, the median payout for the 144 foundations with over $1 billion was 5.1%. A lot of those expenses can go to compensation. They can go to foundation to DAF transfers, which I know that we'll discuss. But, TLDR, our system effectively classifies pools of capital under management in perpetuity, tax exempt, as charity. And that both increases inequality and shortchanges groups on the ground that are doing actual charitable work. And I think that when Congress formed our laws that govern charity over 50 years ago in 69, which I know will come up a lot, they did not intend for things to look this way.
And by charitable intermediaries, you're talking about private foundations, donor
Yes, I'm talking about mainly private foundations, but I think a lot of people on this call aren't strangers to the unbelievable skyrocketing popularity of donor advised funds. And you'll have to come to the next briefing to hear more about that. But those are charitable intermediaries. I'll just add one more interesting statistic, which is that our team has studied everybody who signed the Giving Pledge. So the ultra wealthy American philanthropists who have committed to giving the majority of their wealth away, either in their lifetime or upon their death. And around 80% of the gifts of people who signed on in 2010 have gone to these intermediaries, by and large foundations. We can just look at the statistics and know that 80% has not made it out into communities and into creating systemic change.
Okay. Craig,
Well,
what do you want to add? Thank you, Bella.
so first I'd like to say thank you for making me part of this. John described me as the experienced funder. I think that means the oldest and the one that may not be here next year. So he put me on a panel this year. I want to also say that I think that the work that Bella and her group do is probably the source of more of my ideas than any other place. They just do an incredibly rigorous job of researching the sector. Right now, if I had one kind of paragraph on foundations, I'd say they've often become very self-serving institutions. Self-serving in that their focus is on perpetuity, not necessarily on helping the nonprofit sector. Self-serving in that many of the largest ones eat up a large amount of their required distribution each year in internal expenses. There's some that are really egregious. I'm not going to name them today because it always creates bad mail to me afterwards. But if you go to some of my columns in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, you can see some really, I think, serious misuse of the foundation formula right now. So Bella was absolutely right. The 1969 Tax Reform Act was a very well-intentioned effort that is completely out of date now. The notion that 5% should be the payout made a lot of sense back in the day when foundations put half their money in bonds, half in stocks. Today, go look at the usual portfolio of a place like Rockefeller or Ford, any of the big ones. 60 to 70% of the assets are in these very high producing hedge funds, venture capital, and other vehicles. There is no reason in the world why you couldn't still have most foundations surviving for a long time with a 10% payout.
Okay, so for those who didn't do their undergraduate thesis on the 1969 Tax Act and haven't been stewing in this as much as the rest of us have, each foundation is required to give out 5% a year of their assets, but they can count internal expenses, salaries and other expenses toward that 5%. So they're actually giving out less than 5%. Some of them, as you say, egregiously so. Greg, am I hearing you correct?
Yes. Yeah. And they can also give money to DAFs, donor advised funds, which has become the latest way of meeting the distribution requirement and piling up money at Schwab or Fidelity, or maybe it's even one of the nonprofit places like Donors Trust. But there's a very bad culture that's developed, I think, in the mainstream foundation community. And it's not intentional. These are not bad people, but the incentives are very wrong for them right now.
So I know we're going to be talking about DAFs in the next, donor advised funds in the next briefing, not today, but as they refer to private foundations, because donor advised funds technically are 501c3 public charities. How they got to be that way is the story for the next time. That means that a foundation could just write one check, conceivably, for whatever their distribution is. It goes into a donor advised fund that they control, that the trustees control, and there's no transparency whatsoever.
That's right.
None whatsoever.
Oh, okay. So nothing wrong here. Vu, you have been one of the most beloved burrs under the saddle of foundations, beloved by us, not necessarily by them, over the years. What are your issues with foundations?
Hey everyone, Vu here, calling in from Seattle, which is on Duwamish and Coast Salish land. I am hyped up on chocolate because that's my survival mechanism and helps me calm down a bit. I think that we tend to intellectualize things quite a bit, and I don't think most people realize, we say things like, yeah, they count the operations, but like a foundation could literally hire Kenny Loggins to play at their staff retreat, and what they pay Kenny Loggins would count towards the 5% of the distribution rates, right? And so everything that they pay their CEO, their rent, their retreat, they send the entire staff to Hawaii for a retreat, that all counts towards this 5% distribution. So most people don't even know that, right? So we really need to like de-intellectualize this, and I want to get people angry. The thing that I've been talking a lot about is that when we say philanthropy has not been effective, what we really mean is progressive leaning funders have not been progressive, because conservative funders have been extremely effective. And while they're funding organizations at 20 years at a time, because conservative funders fund like 20 or 30 years, and they fund significant amounts of money in general operating funds, and they don't really think about perpetuity so much, I don't think, because they focus on like, what do we need to do to get all the Supreme Court justices to be right-wing justices? And the left we're still dealing with bullshit, so much bullshit, like foundations requiring a snowflake grant application, or still, like 1 year grants and stuff like that. And I just feel like we have been so focused on the wrong things all the time now, and we have not been learning anything from the conservative movements, which have been the most effective in terms of philanthropy ever, because they are not afraid to fund political engagement. They're not afraid to fund the capture of the courts, or their cultural warriors, or their institutions, or the media. And meanwhile, we're over here like being required to write quarterly reports for a $5,000 shitty grant that took 9 months to be determined on. I'm gonna try to calm down. I'm gonna have to eat some more chocolates here.
Well, yeah. But before you go into your chocolate high there, Vu, I love the fact that you very gently call out foundations on what you call crappy funding policies or practices. And I know you're a restrained guy, but what other policies completely get under your skin?
The policy, I mean, like the paying of family members, for example, right? And counting that towards your 5%. It's really gross that many foundations, I find family foundations to be so weird and archaic as a concept, and we're just like okay with them existing. Like let's put money into this vehicle and take tax donations, but then still only allow family members to be on the boards to control this. It's no longer your money, and yet you still believe and act as if it's your money that you're giving out here as a family foundation. And a lot of family foundations are just weird. They use this vehicle as a way to do family therapy or to bond with one another, spend time together. A lot of them think about like the legacy of philanthropy for their family. And I'm like, I don't give a shit about your legacy. About philanthropy, how about you just pay your taxes? Like, so yeah.
So a couple of Congresses ago, if we could think back that far, there was a proposal called the ACE Act, Accelerating Charitable Efforts Act,
Right.
Which I thought was totally reasonable and could have made some real changes. One of the no-brainer suggestions there was that family members could get paid for working at the foundation or for being board members, but that can't count toward the 5% that we've been talking about of the distributions. Another is that you couldn't count distributions. You can make distributions to DAFs if you were a private foundation. It wasn't cutting that off, but again, you couldn't count it towards the 5% payout. This died in committee and met with huge opposition from the Council of Foundations and other national groups. What's going on there? What are the politics? Whoever wants to answer this.
Well, part of it is that the foundation community, and I'd say this is both conservative and mainstream, are just opposed to any changes right now. Usually they make an argument that any kind of change is going to affect perpetuity or donor freedom or something else along those lines. And that's just a baloney argument. I mean, I take issue a little bit with Vu as someone that's actually studied how conservative foundations fund. They're not doing much better than left-wing foundations in the big scheme of things. There's a few that are better, but there's a few on the left that are better. But all of them are in a point where any notion of reform just brings out everybody to go after you. When I proposed that there be a cap on administrative expenses applied to the distribution requirement, I got an unbelievable amount of mail. What, you don't want well-staffed, well-paid foundations? You want every foundation to move to South Dakota or someplace where people can live cheap rather than be based in Manhattan? Well, yeah, maybe I do. But there's no incentive right now for foundations to be careful about their expenses, other than the opprobrium that someone like Vu or Bella gives them in reports. So yeah, there's just it's a very archaic world that is totally resistant to any kind of change.
Yeah, Craig, I agree with that assessment. I think that on the one hand, there's very righteous populist concern about concentrated power, weird family foundations like Vu is talking about. Like if we don't intervene, there's going to be massive agglomerations of capital controlled by families that are tax subsidized up to 73 cents per dollar, that are completely democratically unaccountable. Everybody is concerned about that, from the furthest left to the furthest right. What's so difficult about this moment is that charity reform, any kind of meaningful charity reform that actually gets at the problem, is jeopardized by how much this presidential administration has shown that it wants to target its perceived opponents, that it wants to sort of take and warp those ideas to go after people that they don't agree with. And I can't think of any, charitable organization that would want to opt into that kind of scrutiny. And so that does kind of throw a wrench in the ability to pass charity reform that, again, addresses the really meaningful and appropriate rational concern, but isn't used as a cudgel. And so that puts us in a really difficult position, I think, where the policy environment demands, again, interesting new partnerships. Like Craig's team and ours worked on a really interesting polling project to actually gauge that the ACE Act did not go far enough for people. And while it totally addressed the common sense concerns, there's an appetite once the public is educated on how all these tax dodges and self-dealings work, which are obscured for a reason, they want to see way more rigorous reform. But again, in this environment, how can that coalition, create equitable effects and create a kind of outcome that is good for society? So that means that then voluntary efforts take center stage, and the ways that funders recognize how perilous this moment is actually step up. And I'm really concerned that voluntary efforts can only go so far without structural reform. I'm really curious what Vu has to say about this, actually.
Yeah.
I think we might need to talk about our strategies for getting these reforms and how we frame them, right? I talk about the Overton window, which is like, like the span of ideas that people actually accept at any given time. Like marriage equality was not in the Overton window a few years ago, right? And now it's moved to the point where most people will support marriage equality. And we have not been shifting this Overton window to progressive sides very much, whereas conservative funders, again, conservative movements have been, and they've been saying really scary things out there and getting people just kind of like used to it, so that when they propose things that are less extreme, people are like, oh, okay, maybe that seems reasonable. So maybe one of the weaknesses of the ACE Charitable Act effort a while ago was that it was too mild. I mean, one of the provisions, the top provision was if you give to a DAF, then you have up to 15 years to allocate that money to nonprofits. 15 years. That's ridiculous. I feel like if we're going to do this again, we need to go on the opposite side. Like no money that's spent on operations at foundation should be counted towards the 5% at all. Like at all. No, yeah. So that's something we should think about. Like, and then if you give money to a DAF, then you need to distribute that within a year. Okay, not 15 years. So we gotta stop kind of playing around this sort of white moderate tendency that we have, trying to appease the people in the center. It's been biting us in the ass because we're trying to appease everyone in the center. No one is happy, and then nothing gets accomplished.
Well, let's also be honest, though, that the opposition of the ACE, by the way, that happened during the Biden administration.
Right.
But there was one comment here says there was 13 million. By my count, there was something like $40 million put up in lobbying money to stop it, mainly by the large sponsors of DAFs, but also the foundation associations and so forth. Our side on that argument never got a chance to make simple arguments like, you go to the public and you say, okay, so a billionaire is going to give $500 million, get a 25% tax break on it, and then hire two of their kids that couldn't get jobs any other place. And that's all going to be counted as part of the charitable purpose. They're going to go, no, that doesn't sound like a good deal. So we've also got to find ways of taking the kind of stories that I know Vu and Bella's team and others have captured and getting them out there so the public understands what's going on.
Yeah. And stop talking about percentages and this sort of thing and get at some core corruption, really, or things that just make no sense to the average person when they hear them explained as the way Vu described it a moment ago. Craig, having said that, you have written that you think there might be bipartisan support for a higher payout rate. Do you still feel that way, and how's that going to happen?
Well, first, if you actually look at most Republican senators, very few of them have any kind of big philanthropy in their states. You've got a few strange ones, Kansas, South Dakota, strangely enough, and Indiana. And it's been Indiana that has really been a blocker on the Republican side to change. But there's a real potential there. Now, the motives on each side are very different. There's a lot of conservative voters, Republican voters, that see foundations as, in a way, the enemy. They see them as funding largely politicized left-wing organizations. And I know that's not your perspective, Vu, but that is what you would hear if you went to my hometown in South Dakota, or even 60 miles outside of Minneapolis in southern Minnesota. So there is a sense out there that these institutions are broken. Very different reasons on left and right. but it wouldn't be the first time that this had been brought together. I mean, Bella can attest that in 1969, it was a very motley crew that came together to push through the Reform Act at that time. Some motivated by very, very bad impulses, including racism, some by simply dislike of wealth and power being concentrated in an unaccountable way. So there's ways to pull this together if people are smart. Part of what's needed is that organizations like the Philanthropy Project and others do need the kind of money that would allow them to wage the kind of campaign that Fidelity, Schwab, and the other big players in this sector can mount when there is legislation that they don't like.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Craig is saying about building a countervailing force to the what we've sort of termed the status quo charity lobby, which is sort of a combination of people who run huge foundations, staff sponsors, all different kinds of people actually across the ideological spectrum who want to preserve giving and the freedoms and the accesses that are allowed by our current system. Nonprofit workers, working class people who are so angry about wealth inequality, they don't have safe waters to swim in the same way. And I also think a lot of the best storytellers and advocates for philanthropy reform are nonprofit workers who this is a third rail to touch for. They don't want to alienate their funders. They don't want to, get in trouble for having the beliefs that they do about the dysfunction of the system. And so there really does need to be organizing around creating that kind of countervailing coalition to advance legislation. And again, that really does not fall into or isn't vulnerable to using for witch hunting, using in a unidirectional way.
Who you have thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts. I just I don't know. I feel like we've been talking about this for a while now, right? Um, and it's been we've been complaining about this stuff for decades now, and it's not. I don't know what we need to do. I feel heartened that when Craig says that there's bipartisan support for actually doing something, but like I think about like gun reform. Most of the public, like 90% of the public, are in favor of gun reform, but there still hasn't been any. So we could whip up the public here about this, but there has to be some ways to actually move things through the legislature. And I think the progressive foundation, leaning foundation, who might actually support something or like this, they're not willing to be political. They're not willing to fund advocacy work, lobbying work, or political candidates to be elected who might actually pass these things into law. So I'm not really clear what we need to do at this moment.
What I'd be interested, I know all of you have been working on issues like this, on what a better system would look like. What would the payout rate be? Now, Craig, you go way out there, and Vu will probably say it doesn't go far enough. You're advocating 10% a year.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the performance results of, say, the top 20 foundations. Even take out strange ones like Lilly, which I think has doubled its endowment in the last 5 years, thanks to wonder drugs. But, these foundations are doing very, very well. They've got very aggressive, sophisticated investment techniques. And then there's a whole set of other large foundations where, frankly, they don't bother to do anything creative. So maybe they need an incentive if they really want to be there in perpetuity to invest their money a little bit smarter and more wisely than they have. No, I think 10% is completely reasonable. Now, again, every time I do one of these, I'll get mails showing somebody has done a back of the envelope estimate that shows that by 2300, there won't be any foundations left in America. I really question that. Everybody thought that DAFs would mean that there would be the creation of no new foundations. but for exactly the reasons that Vu was talking about, this sort of need to have a family name on something prominent and an institution that you totally control, people are still creating foundations, and they will if there's a 10% payout.
Do we need them to be around though? I think like Farhad
No,
in the comments,
no,
like,
as a matter of fact, we
they would
don't.
just solve these problems and be done with it. Why do we even need foundations? Why should we have a system where we have a bunch of people, building wealth through inequitable means, which we haven't even talked about? It's like slavery and stolen indigenous land and worker exploitation, environmental degradation and tax avoidance. And then they get to pick and choose the issues that they care about based on their whims and their passion, which changes every year or so. Like, what kind of wacky system is that? And then for them to think that they have perpetuity. Perpetuity is one of the worst concepts ever. It shows such a lack of imagination. It's
Yeah.
like we don't believe we can actually solve these issues, so we just want to assume we're just always going to be around because these issues, inequity and poverty and race, they're always going to be around because there's no way to solve them at all. The lack of imagination is staggering among the progressive leaning foundations here. Like, what exactly are you saving for in a fascist totalitarian state that we're heading towards here? Your foundation will mean shit.
Yeah.
Your endowments, yeah. What does it mean?
No, Vu, it's so true. And I think this is where I am gonna rewind to the original debate in Congress and in the Senate about establishing our 1969 laws. They were talking about if perpetuity was democratic or not. And,
Right.
Pete Peterson, who was leading the coalition to be the voice of the Rockefeller Foundation, he said that a fixed life was anti-philanthropic and that perpetuity, shouldn't just be granted to every single philanthropy, just, by definition, but that only the foundations that could prove that they could survive. He had kind of a Darwinist approach that I thought, I don't personally agree with. But the point being, the legislative history of the laws that we've taken as established, fixed, common sense for this long, embedded in the debate that sort of hammered them out, is all this proof that we are compelled to continually reevaluate as a society if these laws work. And I'm using Michael Cavate's reporting for Inside Philanthropy here. There are now 66 Americans with twice as much money as the Ford Foundation. This is a very different philanthropic landscape with a lot more consolidated plutocratic control than even what Wright Patman and the Southern populists were railing against in the late 60s. Inequality is back to the levels it was at in the 1910s when, Ford and Carnegie were giving out more money than the federal government was equipped to give out in welfare. We're kind of back to those times, and the idea that we can just continue to subsidize as taxpayers the perpetuity of foundations that don't pull their weight. I don't think that people want that. I just don't think that discourse is like equipped to bring this question to everybody. And that's something that I know that's different than a principled, advocacy campaign. But people don't understand this. Like, regular people do not know that they are subsidizing perpetual institutions that are governed by families. And if they did, what would change? I think that the right has been really effective at bringing that up and getting people angry about it. I realize we haven't even talked about the excise tax debate in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and how that was defeated by a bipartisan coalition, though it passed the House. But yeah, we should absolutely be thinking bigger. I mean, when politicians and advocates and philanthropic leaders don't understand how angry people are and how discordant the system is with the status quo for people who can't afford anything, we're in trouble, and we need to do something way bigger.
Right now, there's some backlash against billionaires, which I'm very happy to see, and we need to foment that. I feel like, like people are not happy with billionaires. I mean, there's a few assholes who are defending the billionaires because they don't understand that they're not going to be a billionaire.
Right.
But but they're delusional and thinking that,
Right. They're not a temporarily embarrassed billionaire. Yeah.
Exactly. And but there's a lot of people who are just like, you know what? We don't want that. It's unethical for anyone to be a billionaire, and they've just taken way too much. It doesn't make any sense for 12 assholes to own more than 80 or 90% of the world's wealth at ever. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like, we're in some sort of weird dystopian society here, and we're just like okay with that. So what do we need to do to actually get people to understand and like whip up this anger towards billionaire? Because I don't think anyone should be a billionaire, and now might be a good time to actually do something about it.
So Vu, I'm not opposed to billionaires. I can't say I know any, but I'm not opposed to them. But I am opposed to subsidizing their philanthropy. And one of the things I often cite when I'm talking to groups like this is if you took away the charitable deduction and the nonprofit status, 80% of all the nonprofits in the United States would not really be affected. Most of their donors don't take the charitable deduction. They don't turn a profit, so they wouldn't be taxed. So most of the effect would happen on these extremely large institutions, the big universities, the big hospitals, the big cultural institutions. And frankly, I don't have any problem saying maybe we shouldn't be subsidizing them anymore.
Letting that sit there for a bit. I
Well,
mean, one of the
it's an
issues.
interesting point if you think about it, because most nonprofits are completely out of this game.
Right.
They don't have a lot of donors that take charitable deductions, and they don't make a profit. So it's really a moot point for them.
Right.
I think that's a good way. We can disagree whether billionaires it's ethical to be a billionaire. Craig, I agree with you that we shouldn't be subsidizing them. I mean, the biggest welfare queens or whatever are like corporations and rich, very wealthy individuals. And they've controlled the media to blame everyone else and thinking that it's like poor people who are using the government's resources and so on, when it's actually like very wealthy corporation billionaires avoiding paying their taxes and stuff. And so, yeah, like, I don't know. We need to do a much better job with the narrative here. And that's something that the right wing has also been much more effective at. Like the fastest growing YouTube channel right now is Turning Point USA, because their revenues are like, they have like $100 million to spend, per year or so. And so they're able to like the right wing is able to control the narrative and just like start blaming governments for being ineffective, blame poor people, and so on. And we have not done a very good job. When people know about these things, when people know about how much the rich people are abusing the systems, how much we're subsidizing their stuff, then people get very angry. But we have not been able to do that because we just won't play that game. We won't work on changing the cultural narratives here. We won't fund it.
I think it's really important as well to understand that through perpetuity, they're perpetuating the billionaire class, or maybe even just centimillionaire class, are passing that power along to their heirs. I've heard anecdotal evidence, and we should get Helen Flannery figuring this out, Bella, at your shop.
Hey,
How
Helen.
many
I know she's
many
here.
divorce settlements over the years have involved fights over access to or control of donor advised funds and private foundations? Because, yeah, even though technically it's not theirs, it very much gives power, status, and influence to whoever controls these things. And divorcing people are fighting like cats and dogs over these assets that technically they don't control.
We've seen divorced women be some of the most prolific and experimental funders. So I totally, I know why you bring that up, Al.
I'm all for Mackenzie Scott. I don't know if it was worth being married that long to Jeff Bezos, but all power to her.
Something I just bring up in addition to Vu's point is that in order to, I know we've kind of talked about this, but in order to finance that kind of strategic and very targeted work, you do kind of have to exploit some of the loopholes of the philanthropic system that we all don't want to exist, right? Dark money networks, using daft transfers to obscure chain of title, getting smart about taking tax exemptions to maximize your the wealth that you can use for these kind of activities. So I know that Craig is saying that a lot of charitable giving isn't motivated by tax benefits, and indeed the people who get the benefits are like less than 10% of itemizers, is I think the ballpark.
3%.
3%. Okay, see, there you go.
Very small. That gets
the rules change.
Yeah.
That's even different. But I just think it is worth bringing up the tension between the tactics that are against what I think a lot of us stand for, which is more transparency in the sector and, kind of like ethical behavior that is about relinquishing power perhaps before that kind of strategic work can be done. And that's always, I think, a big challenge that the left faces, where there's a sort of like, there's just a tension there between ideal outcome and tactics needed to use to get there.
I want to turn to some questions and hear your answers in a moment. What should we say to the people who are listening to this? Now, there are probably a few foundation staff who are feeling under attack, and that's okay. They should hear this. And I will point out that one of the structural problems is that foundation CEOs are paid according to the size of their foundations, as are the other chief staff. So, if you're $100 million foundation, you get paid a lot more than if you're running a $30 million foundation. So there's this perverse incentive to make your foundation larger. But what should we tell people who are listening here, who are revved up, who are writing in? What should they be doing about this? I mean, we're all looking for somebody to organize us.
Well, I mean, this is why we have the Philanthropy project, right? We need people to talk about this. I don't think most people understand what the issues are, because in some ways, one, because they're just trying to survive here and they just don't have time to focus on different things. And two, this is a very wonky topic. And it's hard for people to understand like all of these laws and regulations and all this stuff. Like the fact that most people don't even know that foundations' operating expenses count towards their 5% distribution rate. I mean, that's like a simple talking point that people don't even know about. Like when I did a reel on this on Instagram, people were like, what the heck? I did not even know that. Right. And so we need to do a much better job educating people. So everyone who is riled up right now, like go tell your friends, get them riled up too. And then we need to start organizing better here.
What do you say to nonprofit leaders? Many of them are on this call right now. And I've worked in the nonprofit world and with the nonprofit world my whole career. And I think they're visionary and brave. And well, no, they're not brave. They're visionary, smart, dedicated. They make lemons out of lemonade, use whatever metaphor you want. But in the end, most of them are terrified of offending their funders. How do we provide a little bit of gumption in the sector so that people don't say, oh, it's just you, Vu, it's just you, Craig. People don't really feel that way because we don't hear anything from the community, from the nonprofits.
Well, part of it is that the community doesn't really know these stories, as Vu just said. We have to have ways of telling better stories about the reality of the foundation community. And I'd even say the bigger nonprofits. There's a really interesting report that Scott Hodge came out with lately of the 10 or is it the 20 biggest nonprofits, Bella, that are all basically set up like corporations.
Yeah.
With big paid boards and so forth, even though they're 501c3s. Most Americans would say, wait, that is my local homeless shelter. That isn't the local food bank. This is appalling. But those stories don't get out very easily. The leadership is not going to come from leaders of the nonprofits. I used to run a nonprofit and raise money from foundations. I wouldn't go out and do this. I had 150 people that I had to support through the organization. You're not going to take that risk. So it has to be those of us who are either out of the game now, but still have an interest in it, or that have some kind of independent way of supporting themselves to get the ball rolling. Now, I think once these stories get out, then I think it's a different situation. But we haven't even gotten to the first part of the effort, where people know what is really going on, how the nonprofit sector is getting abused in a lot of ways, as well as foundations. So that's where you got to start.
That's a really interesting point, Craig. And I think we agree that really interesting advocates here who make the water safer to swim in, as I said earlier, for nonprofit workers and people who need this reform, are wealthy people and donors who recognize the harms that this concentrating power in the sector prove, and sometimes from a place of self-interest where they're just like, this is making an unstable society for me, but also who really want to transform the world with their wealth. There's a ton of funders like this. We were helping start up organizing something called the Donor Revolt for Charity Reform, which was a bunch of funders who supported increasing payout rates, creating a payout rate for DAFs. I think I really feel like what needs to happen for people to understand these stories at scale is for philanthropy reform policy ideas and abuses to be sort of appended to messaging about tax reform, economic populism, and protecting our democracy. I think that people know that there's a dark money, shadowy dark money network that influences the outcomes of elections and that billionaires get to exert their voice, often using tax-exempt funds to do so or tax-benefited funds to do so. That we need to make the next building block of that message be, and here are the reforms that we just need to throw into whatever reconciliation package, comes down the pike. Then to talk about what should be in that, I think that there's kind of nesting dolls. And I think the easiest ones that I think Vu, Craig, and I would all, and you, Al, would be like, let's do these in a heartbeat. And the egregious abuses like self-dealing and family compensation from being counted towards 5%, and foundation to DAF transfers to the tune of several $billions a year. A little bit harder would be structural reform to double payout at least, or to return to the legacy that was in the 1969 bill of you have to give what your income has been off of your assets every year. That was a fluctuating rate for a while. It got sanded down to 5%. And then, I think that people who receive nonprofit grants and people who are active in their community could be really meaningful advocates for creating a kind of giving pledge with teeth. In the meantime, while we don't have structural reform, or we can't, meaningful campaigns to ramp up voluntary efforts like the Level Up Pledge are very interesting to me. There's some really courageous Spend Out Foundation leaders who I think are doing a great job trying to inspire other foundation executives and board members to understand what their power is as like shareholders in this system. But I would love to see, decolonizing wealth. I know that there's some people involved in all different kinds of donor networks and advocacy spaces who could be taking this on. I'd love to see all of this scale in popularity and public consciousness. And I think that storytelling, as we always say, is a really good way to do that. But also, again, really emphasizing creating safety for people who work in nonprofits and understand these abuses from their experience, getting them connected to the policymaking process.
I agree. And I think that we tend to talk about actions without talking about just the philosophies that have been preventing us from being effective. The entire sector has been trained to be very grateful to donors, to funders, so and then we've just been having it's like crumbs. We've been subsisting on crumbs. So whenever a funder gives out a little bit more money, we're like, oh, yay. And we start praising them. And this reinforces them for continuing to do the bare minimum and incremental changes. Like I remember when Amazon, I think, gave $100 million to address hunger or something. And everyone in the sector was like, yay, look how great it, blah, blah, or when, was it Michael Dell, who was like, they decided to give out these little $250 accounts to children under 18, several million children under 18, $250, and spending $6 billion into doing it. And a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, the Dells are so generous, blah, 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 blah. And a colleague of mine, a partner, Ray, was like, if actually Dell paid his fair share of taxes, he would be paying like $50 billion,
Right.
So we need to stop being so grateful all the time. Like the entire sector, how we've been trained to do fundraising. It's like, yes, you did this because of you, blah, blah, blah. Like we entrench this philosophy, this attitude of gratitude, which have an attitude of like righteous anger right now. And so I don't want people to just be like this. It's so excessive. The handwritten thank you notes, the donor walls, the special events, wine and cheese events for donors, making them feel like heroes. When we really need to talk to them about where their wealth comes from, maybe they should pay more taxes and, return stolen land and, all of the stuff that like we just won't talk to them about. And so then whenever they do even something even a little bit, we're like so happy and we keep praising them. We keep praising them instead of like saying, hey, Michael Dell, why don't you just pay your $50 billion in taxes that you owe?
Vu, you were talking before we started about the MacArthur Foundation making a big deal out of going to a 6% payout for a couple of years and receiving all sorts of praise.
Well, I don't want to point out.
Oh, now I put you
specific
on the spot. I put you on the spot. You weren't saying it. Somebody I was talking to beforehand.
Someone was saying that. All right. Like,
Someone was saying that from my mouth
mean,
to
I
John.
think I said it, Al. I just found it very strange how proud they've been of it.
Yeah, I mean,
There you go, Boo.
it's a small
No.
step in the right
What
direction.
does it take to fight fascism right now is what all these funders need to start thinking about here.
I will say, as the notes have been going by, I've been chided, probably appropriately, that it's not up to the nonprofits to stand up to the machine. But I will say it should be up to the organizations that represent nonprofits, the state associations, the National Council. But most of the national organizations are opposed to any kind of foundation reform. You guys work in those circles more than I do. How do we get people to speak up for what we've been talking about?
Well, I think there would be some movement, for example, on the application of administrative expenses towards the distribution requirement. Again, whenever I've written those, I get a lot of angry letters from the foundations where I've named their chief executive as getting an extraordinary salary. And I usually get one or two calls from one of the associations saying, this is really tough. We probably would be interested in some kind of ceiling or something that would prevent abuses. So that might be one place to start, because I'll tell you, when people look at the numbers of what people get paid and how much money gets chewed up in foundations by expenses, and the fact that there's no incentive for them to be more efficient. Every other institution, if you ran a typical nonprofit that way, nobody would fund you. So I think that would be one place that I would start. And maybe you don't go to 10%, maybe you just say 7%. And my guess is that you'd find more than a few foundations that would even say a 7% distribution requirement. Okay, we can live with that as long as it doesn't go up to 10.
One person, and I'm sorry I don't have the name in front of me, asked, this would go to Bella, I think, a giving pledge with teeth.
Yeah.
Tell us about the teeth, Bella.
Well, I see the comments in the chat saying a pledge is not enough, and I completely agree. When I say that, I think the most important is the teeth. Our study on the Giving Pledge just really drove home that if this is the behavior coming from people who have made the biggest public commitment, to spending their wealth on philanthropy, and they are all getting, our finding was that the original signers collectively have gotten nearly 300% wealthier since they signed on. Without correcting for inflation, that's around like 160% as of last summer. As inequality keeps getting wilder, that's only going to go worse. And absent intervention, again, we think structural reform is obviously the way to get this behavior to change. We need a voluntary effort that actually makes people who commit to this and get the reputation burnishment to actually do it, and not just count a grant to your foundation as the final destination, but what comes out of the foundation, because most are counting their foundation gifts, 80% of those gifts. So I think that a giving pledge with teeth would look like taking after the example of Chuck Feeney, who gave away all of his wealth in his lifetime. It would look like taking inspiration from Mackenzie Scott, who people in the chat, they know Ball, and they know that she's still wealthier. She's struggling to spend her wealth down, even as she's given I believe over $20 billion at this point. So I think that would look like dramatic and disciplined public accountability. Yeah, I see this comment. Structural reform based on federal legislation, that's teeth. I completely agree. In the interim, before that exists, what are we going to do? How are we going to make common sense and make social stature be reliant on actually fulfilling your promise? We've already our report has been really interesting in its public effect of getting reporters to straight up ask pledgers about our findings and just say, what do you think about that? We've gotten Melinda French, confronted by the findings, and Craig Newmark, who just signed on, saying, I really want to inspire other billionaires to pony up some dough, he said. What if we educate a lot of people about the pledge, about this failed commitment to the pledge, What if every time a person who pledged was interviewed, they were really asked about what they're going to do, what their plan was, what their giving is going to be? I mean, I know that that's not enough, but in the meantime, we don't have anything like that. We have all these opportunities, as Vu's saying, for self-congratulation and complimenting and cheerleading. And yeah, I think that I'm also looking to all of you for suggestions for what a giving pledge with teeth could look like. We need people to really commit. And I think people like that are like leaders of the Stupski Foundation, leaders of foundations that are really sort of publicly committing to spend out all of their money. And they can have a lot to contribute to this as well.
I know we're running out of time here, but can we I think we need to stop being so politically neutral with these things. It's like, what are people spending out more money for? If conservative foundations are going to spend out more money to control the legislature and the courts and everything, just because they spend out more money doesn't mean that it actually makes society better here.
Right, that's a big tension here too. Yeah.
So I don't know. I think about Melinda French and Mackenzie Scott. Like, if I had their money, I'd be putting $100 million to have an organization that would push back against Turning Point USA. I will start working on the court system and electing more political leaders and controlling the media. I would buy a Fox News.
Right.
These are strategies that we refuse to engage in. So we need to talk about that too.
I had a play director in high school, and he always said, you want to leave one curtain call too few. So while people are applauding, the lights come on and they say, boy, I wish they went on longer. I wish we went on longer, but I see Jan showing up, and I think you're the gentle hook for our conversation. You're pulling us off the stage.
Thanks, everybody. Let me just make sure you can see our slide. So I just wanted to say on behalf of the Philanthropy Project how much we appreciate everybody here, and I love this debate. I wish we'd gotten to, there were so many questions, really intriguing questions. I think just a couple, I think just want to highlight for future thought. One is the role of the financial services industry and the wealth managers in the issue of philanthropic misdoing. And I think the other one is kind of like the tension between encouraging foundations and well-meaning donors and regulation, right? There's an army of people encouraging donors to do better. But I think the Philanthropy Project has more of a focus on the regulatory side, because many of the people that are doing these things are not well-meaning, misguided people. They're actually people that are explicitly using foundations for not the right things. But thanks you so much. So anyway, one of the two key questions that many people have written is, can we get some examples from more reports? So if each of you on the panelists could send us one or two links to things you've written, then we'll send them out to everybody in a few days along with the recording for this so that they can see it or pass it on to other people. This is the first in this series of 3. The next one focuses on donor advised funds. And you can see we have really terrific people participating in that. And then the third one will be on charitable giving, incentives, and tax laws. Maybe, as Vu pointed out, this is a wonky topic, and this is probably the wonkiest of the wonky topics, charitable tax law. So along with the recording, you'll also get a link to be able to register for the next one. And then just wanted to say thank you on behalf of John and me and everybody on the working group. And you can subscribe to our newsletter here. And thank you all very much for joining, and have a great rest of your day, everybody. Bye.